Well, good afternoon. Um, Thank you for having us here today. It's a pleasure to exciting and amazing organization. I've had the pleasure of working with CFF and with Val and Catherine and the team for quite a few years. And so I was absolutely thrilled when they asked us to participate today. My name is William Beer. I'm based here in New York City. I'm a managing director at Accenture, and I head up our Northeast Financial Services cybersecurity team. And I'm thrilled to be joined by a colleague today. Holly, why don't I pass it over to you and let you introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this experience. This is my first experience here with the Cyber Futures Foundation. So I'm really appreciative and grateful to everyone that's allowed me to be here today. Just a quick introduction. My name is Holly Liu, as William Beer said, and I am a security senior analyst out of the Accenture Northeast Financial Services practice. I've been at Accenture for almost about 2 years now, and I've been in cyber for a little bit longer. So really just starting out in my career, and there's so much more to learn here. So hopefully I can impart any insights that I have.
Well, Holly, thank you for
Mhm.
taking time out of your busy day to have a chat with me
Yeah.
and with the CFF members today. What we're going to do is really have an informal conversation. No slides.
Yep.
We can go off track, on track, depending on what we feel is best.
Mhm.
If people have questions, feel free to share them with us, and we'll do our best to respond. But what we wanted to do today was really talk about three things. One, a day in the life of a consultant or a professional at Accenture. And I'm going to ask Holly some questions, and she'll ask me some questions, and we'll see where
Mhm.
that takes us.
Mhm.
Two, touch on learning and career development. So how do we learn? How do we learn on engagements? How do we learn through more formal channels, and what we do in Accenture to help and support our employees, and obviously deliver successful projects to our clients? And then the third piece is to talk a little bit about the future. And if we think about the future of consulting, and we think about the future of our careers, what does that look like for both of us? And what do we expect? What do we desire? And what are we planning for the future years? So those are the three things that I thought we'd touch on today. Holly, did I miss anything, or is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you got it all on dot. So we can go ahead and kick off.
Okay. Well, listen, let's start with today. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about maybe what does your average day look like at Accenture, Holly? I mean, we're a massive
Yeah.
organization. We're over 700,000 people now,
Yeah.
which is mind-boggling. But talk us through what your typical day looks like, and maybe share some
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah, no, of course. So currently I am on a 6 month long engagement with a big tech client. And that's been a super exciting opportunity. So I guess I'll kind of just methodically go through, like the hours of my day. So Accenture is such a huge company. And because of that, we have people that are onshore, meaning the people that are in the States, Europe, right? But then we also have this huge team offshore. So we have people from India, Philippines that are also doing work with us. So there's a really collaborative nature that exists within our company to help deliver what we need for our clients and meet their expectations. So all that to say, the first thing that I do in the morning is around 8:30 a.m. I take an offshore call, right? I typically, what will happen is the night before, I'll send them kind of a list of action items. Like, here's what we need to get done, if you guys could work on this would be great. Have a quick meeting with an offshore team. That's going to typically be around 30 minutes, address that. And then once that's over, then I'll shift over to my onshore sync, right? And that's kind of like the team that's within the United States, hopefully on the same time zone.
Right.
And that's where we'll kind of, address anything that came up from the day before, right? How are we moving, or how are we progressing against what the client is expecting for us? Let's talk about deliverable milestones, what are things that we can be doing differently. So typically that's kind of how my day works, at least, just internally. And then once we kind of move into the day, our client is usually, they're on the West Coast. So they'll log on, and that's when we kind of get into the really collaborative aspect with them, where we'll get on calls with them, based on what we're working on for them. They'll say, hey, you know what, like, could you guys revise this? Could you look over this again? And then from that point on, then we'll kind of shift over and get into the more, hey, can you jump on a call real quick? And that's kind of how the rest of the day ends up going. We do have kind of a team wrap up by the end of the day just to kind of go over what we've accomplished in the day as well with our client. So I think, I've talked a little bit about kind of what I work on from a security perspective for the client, but also just want to highlight that at Accenture specifically, not only are you working on your client engagements, but there's also things like +1s, right? And that's where you're working on internal initiatives. And internal initiatives can be anything from selling work to building out employee resource groups to building out security Skillshare training series, right? So these are all different initiatives that I personally had some sort of involvement in. And it really keeps things going because not only am I feeling like, okay, like I'm learning, security knowledge from my client, but then I also get this other side of the business aspect within Accenture. So long-winded way of saying that's my day.
Sounds like a very busy day. I mean, what are some of the things that you really love about your career here at Accenture, and maybe also what are some of the things that you don't like as much? I mean, can just give us a bit of good with the bad. Just give us a
yeah. So and it's funny, I recently kind of came to this realization and had this epiphany of it's like there's two sides to it. I love it, but then sometimes I'm like, and I would say that it's the problem solving aspect. And the reason why sometimes I don't love it is because it's frustrating. When I can't figure out the answer, it's frustrating. But I think one thing that's really amazing about Accenture and what we do is, and I think this is really what's helped me grow the most, is listening to a client. They may not understand exactly what they need or want, but taking that one statement that they said, right, and being able to create something, an entire deliverable out of that. I think that to date is probably one of, I would say, my greatest accomplishments within my career itself. And one of the things I enjoy the most about it, the ability to take what someone said in their head, when they were just brainstorming, and actually creating it into something that's material and can actually be used, I would say is one of the things that I really love about consulting and Accenture security consulting specifically. And it's just frustrating, right? Sometimes it can be really challenging, right? When things are just up in the air, but I think the ambiguity of it is also kind of what makes it fun. So two sides to it. And I'm sure, William, you can also attest to that as well.
Yeah, and I love your answer, and I love the complexity of consulting, the fact that we have to multitask, almost on a constant
on a daily basis.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, and again, if I think about the size of our practice, we're over 10,000 people, and so a lot of the challenges that I think we face are dealing with the scale of our practice, dealing with the scale of our firm, dealing with the complexities of some of the client problems that you just referred to, Holly. And also something that I have to deal with on a daily basis is making sure I don't get my wires crossed, because I'm dealing with multiple clients on a daily basis. I have to go from one meeting to another. And, obviously, because a lot of our meetings are online, you don't have that natural break that you used to have when you would get on the subway and go from client A to client B, or take a plane to go somewhere else. So sometimes it's a little difficult to make sure you don't get your wires crossed. But again, we're getting pretty good at it after, 2 years of doing this online.
Yeah. I will always say consultants are like the best people to travel with. Anything planning wise, they got it, because we always have to multitask. There's just a lot of thought that goes behind everything.
That makes sense. Hey, Holly, what about maybe an example of one of your most exciting or favorite projects that you were involved on? I think I may know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you.
I think I'm actually going to give a different one than what you're expecting.
Excellent.
Yeah, because I want to talk about this one, because I think, honestly, it is one of my most memorable projects. And I think part of the reason why it's my most memorable projects is because it was my first one. Okay. So just a bit of, and I think this helps, the audience as well, just a bit of background on myself. I actually didn't graduate with a cybersecurity degree. I don't think that was necessarily a huge thing in the past, but it's becoming a thing. I actually graduated with an industrial and systems engineering degree. And I think people automatically, when they think, engineering, they think, oh, you're super technical, you know everything about computers. That was not the case. Industrial and systems engineering is more about process improvement, right? It's kind of building the gap in between the technical side of things and the business side of things. Needless to say, I did not know a lick about cybersecurity. My journey to cyber was, I did an internship, did, a little bit of inventory work for this cyber project that was going on at a defense company, and then saw like, wow, there's actually so much to learn here. So because of that, that's how I got into cyber. So I think the moral of that point is just that coming in as like a full-time employee, it was really nerve-wracking for me, right? It's like, I didn't graduate with a cyber degree, but there's so much to learn. And this was the first project where essentially it was with a biopharmaceutical company that I'm sure many of you guys have seen throughout the pandemic. A lot of these companies have been acquiring another company, right? Or they've been, divesting their company. So as a result of that, we came in, Accenture Security specifically came in and help perform some due diligence work, right? Assessing the risk that's associated with acquiring another company from a security perspective. And then also figuring out a strategy and a game plan of, okay, now that, company X is going to acquire company Y, how do we protect the safety and the security of this new company to ensure that, we can still operate as normal? And that project was just very memorable for me because, I drew up everything from a strategy roadmap to creating a bunch of assets and accelerators that they could use in order to, because they were acquiring a bunch of companies, right? And to be fair, no deal is going to be the same, but there are a set list of steps that you should take in any acquisition or any divestiture. So I think that was probably my most memorable project. It was everything that I loved about consulting. It was the strategy piece of it, the problem solving, being really collaborative with the client, but then also seeing the real impact of my work, right? Because that acquisition was successful in essence because of the security of it, right? So I know that's not the answer you're expecting, William, but it is my most memorable project, I would say. And that's the thing about consulting, right? It's just, you see the impact, and I think security, it's everywhere. So, yeah.
Do you have any questions for me, Holly?
Yes. So I think I talked a little bit about my journey to security, and I obviously haven't been in industry as much, but I think the audience would love to hear how you got into cyber and how you kind of knew where you wanted to land in cyber as well, because I think there's a lot of different areas you can go.
So thanks for the question. I started my career quite a long time ago. And I actually started working for a company called NCR, which is quite well known, and started working on proprietary operating systems, proprietary mainframes, actually, and proprietary networks. And I think that that's what got me hooked, because I was always fascinated by computers, and I had a computer at home when I was a young kid. But the computer itself was interesting. But it wasn't until it was connected to a network that it really became exciting. And, I was privileged and lucky to have very supportive parents who were helping fund my computer hobby. But when I started to understand the excitement and the opportunities that networking gave to computers, I was hooked. And that immediately started to lead me down the path towards dealing with security issues, because obviously, certain things weren't available at that time. The web wasn't there, to be honest, and a lot of what we think about cyber today just wasn't available in those systems, using the operating systems or hardware that we had at the time. But that said, a lot of the basics that we were dealing with then still are part of what we do today. And what do I mean by that? I mean, I'm speaking to this group today using a very shiny, up-to-date MacBook Air. And you look at it and you think it's a great computer. But if I open Terminal and drop down to the Mac OS command line, it's basically Unix. And a lot of what I was doing many, many years ago from a network security perspective are still very, very valid. Things and lessons that I learned a long time ago are still very valid today. And I think sometimes we get a little caught up in the shiny interfaces or the shiny systems we use without necessarily understanding the basics. So that's kind of how I started my career. And, I moved through a series of companies. I worked for IBM. I worked for Symantec a long time ago, which we fairly recently acquired here in Accenture, which always makes me smile. But it was the networking piece and the network security piece that got me started in cybersecurity and got me really hooked and excited. And it's still what excites me today. But I guess the other thing I think that you touched on was, the fascinating and exciting thing for me about cybersecurity it's changing all the time. My
Yeah.
father, before he retired, he was a medical doctor, and I remember he would always talk
Mhm.
about continuous learning to stay on top
Mm.
of his game. He used to always listen to cassettes with lessons or
Yeah.
lectures on them. And I think that's very true for what we do as well. I think if you
Yeah.
want to be in cyber, you have to be ready to be, one, very open-minded, and two, to
Mhm.
learn on a constant or a continuous basis, because the threat landscape's changing, the technology's
Yep.
changing. Obviously, organized criminals or hackers are challenging us all the time. And then with things like moving to the cloud,
Oh
a
my
lot of
God,
what
yeah.
we've done traditionally does not necessarily apply to cloud-based
Mhm.
systems. So it's
Mhm.
a really exciting time to be in cyber. But I think the other thing that's really interesting, which kind of links back to what you said earlier, Holly, is that it's clear now that this is a business problem. It's not a technical problem. And I always say
Yeah.
to colleagues when they start talking about technology, I say, hold on a sec. What When was the last time you looked at your corporate risk register? And what number is cybersecurity on your corporate risk register? And generally speaking, at most organizations, it's number one, maybe number two. And that clearly shows that it's a business problem. And therefore, going to get back again, back to what
Mhm.
you said earlier, Holly, yes, the technical capabilities and technical knowledge is important, but I think it's the convergence between technology and business that really represents the future of cyber and the
Mhm.
opportunity for
Mhm.
professionals, whether they be young or old.
Yeah.
That's where I think the rubber hits the road.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and it leads me to kind of my next question. What advice would you have for, young professionals or professionals in general who are looking to make that transition? Because it sounds like you started out more technical, right? Starting out in network security and making that progression to going more into the business side, because I think you have it, right? You have the technical knowledge, understanding, and you can leverage that in order to bring your insight to the business to help drive decisions forward. So, what advice would you have to emerging professionals who are looking to be those enablement pieces, I would say?
That's a great question. Thank you.
Hmm.
I think it kind of links back to what I was saying earlier about the continuous learning. But
Hmm.
let's use Accenture for a minute as an example. 700,000 people across the globe,
Yeah,
right? It's a remarkable
huge.
company. And
Yeah.
I've only been at Accenture since September of last year. So I'm still
Mhm.
learning every single day. I haven't hit my stride yet.
Yeah.
But the opportunities to learn about different business challenges that our clients bring to us is incredible. And I think that we need to make sure that we don't get kind of stuck in our silos, and that
Yep.
we think more broadly, and that we use everything that the firm gives us to its
Agreed.
full advantage. And I remember many years ago, again, I was a young man at the time, just starting my career. And I remember in a new trainer or a new employees, a new hire session, the CEO of the company came from the United States. I was living in Italy at the time, and presented to us. And one of the things he said was, use the company to your advantage. And I thought, what does that mean?
Like, what does that mean?
But the more I thought about
Yeah.
it, the more I understood was, use all the resources we put at your
Hmm.
disposition to learn,
Totally agree.
to understand more about our clients' challenges and our clients' problems. And so I'm a great believer in working across business units, working across geographies, working international, challenging the status quo, and even things like job rotation,
Hmm.
or listening into other calls or other meetings where maybe you're just a fly on the wall, but you're learning and you're expanding your horizon. I think those are incredible opportunities that we have, and a
Hmm.
lot of that's being facilitated and easier today because of working remotely. So I think that
Hmm.
it's all about broadening our perspectives. And again, I was very lucky and privileged in my career to have spent many years working abroad. If that's
Hmm.
something that's an opportunity for younger professionals, I would wholeheartedly suggest they explore it. And I'm, in my role, I'm very supportive of people who want to do international transfers, because I think that can make a fundamental difference on your perspective, both from a professional point of view and a personal point of view.
Yeah, no, that is a really awesome perspective. I think one question that just kind of came top of mind, you said a lot there with just this concept of collaboration, right? And really understanding how your organization is working. And oftentimes we are working in silos, right? Different organizations and internally have different perspectives on security itself. I've seen it, you've seen it, right? So as you've moved out through your career, and I think this is a really important skill to have, especially as a security consultant, how would you say you've found the ability to drive consensus within an organization from a security perspective?
Love,
I think,
love, love
yeah,
that question. And
yeah,
this wasn't rehearsed. That's a great
yeah,
question.
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I, I think the answer is really quite simple, which is communication skills. Um,
yeah,
a lot of security professionals come from engineering backgrounds or IT
yes.
backgrounds or military backgrounds, where unfortunately, I think in formal education, there isn't necessarily enough emphasis placed on
Hmm.
the importance of communication
Communication,
skills.
I
And
agree.
I, again, was very lucky. I remember when I was growing up and I was 12, 13, my
Yeah,
mother kept pushing us to do public speaking. And it was something that I remember at the beginning of thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I standing in front of 50 people, hundreds of people,
yeah,
talking about hydroponics or talking about the Great Fire of
yeah,
London? I remember today some of the presentations I gave, but it was a wonderful skill to hone and to
yep,
develop. And I think that the better your communication skills are, the more consensus you can build, and that will help and support you throughout your career. And
hmm,
so, again, when I speak to younger folks, oftentimes I say, hey, think about things like Toastmasters, or think about events in your community, in your
hmm,
geography that you can get involved with and hopefully present at, because it is a bit of an art. It does take
yep,
time to do, but
yep,
if you can present with conviction,
yep,
succinctly, concisely, with gravitas, then I think it's quite easy to build consensus. Passion,
yeah.
energy, and good comm skills can take you a very, very long way.
Right. Yeah. And I think exactly emphasizing what you said, we do not emphasize communication in schooling enough. When I came out of college, right, this idea of, oh, I just thought it was a buzzword, right? You should be a great communicator. And then when I started working and I began to realize how different organizations were working in silos, and I think that's the thing with consultants, right? There's this underlying expectation that we are the ones who are going to be driving that consensus. So, in essence, what you're saying is that it is extremely important for us to all be able to effectively communicate in some way or some form. And
Yep.
that's really where I learned it from, is, being in the workforce. But I think it's just having good emotional intelligence, I think, is also a piece of it, right?
Right.
Is being very aware of the meetings, the different personalities that you're going to experience, right? Because we need the technical people. It's just as
Yep.
important as the business people, but we need someone to also bridge that gap. So I think that is a great point that we touched on. I do have another question for you.
Please,
And
please
this
go ahead.
is going to a point that you made before with just how many different, I think the right word for it might be like domains that have popped up, right? As of recently, we think about zero trust security, we think about cloud security. So, based on when you first started cyber, what is the difference in the skill set that you've seen from back then to now?
Okay.
Hmm.
Interesting question. And I think back to a very well known, very highly regarded security company. It was a boutique consulting company called At Stake. And it was, ampersand at stake. And some of you may want to Google At Stake. And At Stake at the time had developed a really clear, succinct way of identifying and communicating what are the different components or domains of security that are relevant for companies. And it was often referred to as the honeycomb diagram, because it looked like honeycombed, right? And there were different cells with different domains, like application security, network security, security awareness training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was laid out very clearly with different levels, so you could understand the importance, and also if a domain was more strategic or more technical in nature. And it's funny, Holly, but when I look at that diagram, because I still have a copy of it after all these
Hmm.
years,
Hmm.
it's still very, very relevant, and
Hmm.
not a lot has changed. And again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about this shiny MacBook that I'm looking at right now. It's beautiful, it's shiny, but
Yeah.
it still is basically the same as the systems I was using. Goodness gracious, I'm going to date myself, 25 years ago, when I was working on a VT100
Yeah.
Unix terminal. The same commands, the same knowledge that I was using then, I can use now on this MacBook Air. And so when I think of that diagram, the honeycomb diagram that At Stake published so many years ago, I still think it's very relevant today. And I would actually suggest that some of the things, and I don't want to criticize zero trust or some of the other, new things that the industry gets very excited about, but those are just layers or wrappers on top of the fundamental domains. I mean, if you go back to information security and you think about people, processes, technology, those three things, and then you begin to break them down, or you think about confidentiality, availability, and integrity of information. You put those lenses on information security today, and a lot of the basic things have remained the same. Yes, some of the technologies have changed. Yes, there's new buzzwords. Some things have come, some things have gone away.
Right.
But the basics, I still think, have remained constant. And that could be debated, Holly, but I'll share the diagram with you, and maybe we'll talk about that offline and we'll see what it looks like.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good perspective, right? Is because we're always talking about how cyber is changing, but I think you kind of just gave us that 5,000 lens foot view of, hey, there are layers of things that have changed, but the fundamental elements are still the same, right? So I think it's so important to go back, especially as we're emerging into our careers, to really understand those elements, those foundational key things that you were just saying. So
yeah, I mean, I'll just give you an example. I remember at the time, a long time ago, one of the things that I like to do in a job interview was ask a candidate, can you illustrate using a pen and a piece of paper what happens from a communication perspective when you type www.cnn.com into your browser? And it's a pretty simple question, but you need to demonstrate a clear understanding of the plumbing, right, below the interface, if you're going to be able to answer it correctly. Or the other one that I also liked, is probably not as applicable anymore today, but using the telnet command, send an email. And if you can send an email using telnet, that demonstrates, again, your understanding of the plumbing and the underlying fundamentals of everything we do today. And some of that's changed a little bit. Yes, there's new versions of protocols and new standards in place to better protect us. But again, a lot of the fundamentals have remained the same, and I think we can't and shouldn't lose track of that. But at the same time, as we said before, there is a continuous learning process that needs to take place because so many things are changing around the basics. But again, think about people, right? People haven't really changed. And, we talk about people, processes, and technology. So have the people aspects changed? Probably not. Have people become a little more savvy about cyber? Not yet, sure.
Just a little bit, maybe 1%.
Holly, let me ask you another question.
Yeah.
What about learning? I mean, how do you and where do you go to stay on top of your game? I know that we offer a lot of things in Accenture. When I was onboarded, I was given an Oculus 2 headset, which was amazing. Yep. And so, Metaverse, 500 people on my onboarding call, and lots of opportunities to engage with colleagues using that. But what do you find useful or works for you?
So I think there's kind of three different forms that I tend to go to when I want to learn something new or I find something that's really interesting. So I will say that the first forum that I use is we have a weekly security Skillshares training series where we invite all these different speakers from all different parts of our practice, right? Some of them are from the cyber threat intelligence, and they'll give really interesting briefings on rising geopolitical tensions, how Russia and Ukraine is affecting our cybersecurity landscape. So that's one forum, right? Because I get to really engage with the audience there as well as the actual speaker who is like kind of like the key holder for all that knowledge. So that's one way that I've found that I've learned a lot of my security knowledge here at Accenture. Another way is, I would say, this is a little bit more informal, but just through networking, understanding different people's career paths is really important. And then seeing, so for example, when I first came in, I had no idea really like the concept of cloud, but just after talking to a few people in cloud, and Accenture provides those services, right? They allow you to get certifications, right? We'll reimburse, and they'll set you up with these like my learning pages where you can learn everything cloud. So I was able to get my AWS cloud certification in the first year that I had joined.
Well done.
And part of that is because Accenture enabled that learning growth for me. And then the third thing I would say, just on a more personal level, is one thing that I always like to do is I just like to listen to podcasts. Podcasts are like my favorite things, as well as just I have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, and I have like this tag for just like cyber articles. And I think, it's important that your job or whatever career that you're in helps enable that, but also aligning that with, what you personally want out of it as well, right? And I think cyber is always going to be an interesting topic to read and to talk about, no matter what people say.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks for
so
sharing.
Those are the three things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, or add my perspective, one is the importance of engaging with a broader group of stakeholders outside the traditional group of cybersecurity experts. So that could mean working with chief risk officers, working with finance folks, working with communication experts, people who bring a different perspective to cyber always stimulate my thought process and help me think about the bigger picture. Obviously, working with younger folks keeps me on my toes because of the passion, the energy, the different thinking. I love that. And I always come away energized from those conversations. The third thing I would also point out is social media.
Yes.
I think a lot of people overlook that, and things like Twitter, and I'm a big fan of Twitter. If I follow 5 or 6 well-known security professionals, whether they be CISOs or domain experts, I keep them in special lists so I can follow them on a daily basis. And if they're sharing, whether it be a point of view or retweeting something that they think is relevant, I'm on it. And that keeps me on my game, and it allows me to have access to almost real-time information about what's happening in the world with regards to cyber, but without necessarily having to go through a website, right? So I don't necessarily have to go to the Wall Street Journal, which I read on a daily basis as well. But to have that raw information coming from some place like Twitter, which is being tweeted by people like, I don't know, Phil Venables, who's the CISO in residence at GCP, who's obviously very well known, or Bruce Schneier, who's also, incredible professional. To watch them and see what they're tweeting about and commenting on is very enlightening, to say the very least.
Yeah. And I guess piggybacking off of something that you had said, you were talking about kind of this concept of just like there's security industry, I think, and then there's security consulting, right? And you've been in both. What is the difference, I guess, if there is any at all, in perspectives from a security, like based on your experiences so far, how has that been different? I'm just curious about that.
Another good question. Look, I think that people who have had experience in industry, generally speaking, have a very, very deep understanding of the business. Okay. So if they've worked, for example, in a large financial service organization for 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be, they will inevitably have matured a good understanding of what that business means, what it represents, the processes, the governance structure, regulations, compliance issues. And I think in consulting, if you don't have industry experience, that type of knowledge is harder to come by. Now, yes, you can mature it over time, having worked with, let's say, financial services. Let's say you work all the time on financial services. Inevitably, you will begin to gather and gain that knowledge, but it will take longer. And I think a lot of the consultants that I've worked with who are the most successful and probably the most highly regarded by their clients are people who have that blend of both, right? People who can bring a broad set of experiences, both from industry and consulting, to the discussion are very, very highly regarded. But I would also say that consultants who don't have that deep industry knowledge because they haven't worked, let's say, for a bank for many years, aren't necessarily at a disadvantage, but what they need to do is bring to bear the full set of experiences that they've matured by working across a larger set of clients. So for example, if I've worked at bank ABC and DEF and GHY, et cetera, I need to share that information. And when I do engage with my clients, obviously respecting confidentiality is critical here, but say, hey, I was speaking to a CISO last week and she mentioned that one of her biggest challenges is this. That type of knowledge, that type of information sharing is very, very important for clients. So to be able to bring to bear, a knowledge of the market as opposed to just an industry is also very, very important.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, you've had so many years in cyber, so you really did get like that full perspective now landing back in consulting, which I'm sure is so valuable for our clients, especially for someone who was in industry.
Right.
So I think, as just like keeping on time as well, as we've talked a little bit about our past, our present, right, where we're at right now. Let's talk about the future, right?
Yep.
So I think this is a great question for you. And I know it's very broad and can be interpreted in so many different ways, but where do you see cyber going?
So it's interesting, that question, because oftentimes when people ask about the future of cyber or future cyber threats, and you see all the big vendors publish their reports generally in the November or December timeframe. They try and take a stab at what could be the future threats for 2023.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes they nail them, but a lot of the time, I think there's a lot of hype there. But what I'm going to say is that I think as an industry, we do not do a good job of forecasting or thinking about the future. And when we do, we're oftentimes accused of using fear, uncertainty, and doubt to sell stuff, which I don't think is true. Because if you think back to the big Sony breach, which was, quite a few years ago, which was devastating. If you had described that to many security professionals 6 months before, I'm sure most of them would have said, nah, that'll never happen. You'll never see the president of the United States comment on it. And it did happen. So it came to fruition. And I think that we need to get a better balance around when we think about the future, but we do need to spend more time thinking about the future of cyber and where it's going. And that's very relevant for the association that we're representing or speaking with today. But I also think, and this is controversial, but I do think that in the future, maybe not the near future, a fair amount of cyber will go away and will be directly embedded in the business or directly embedded in, for example, cloud projects or digital enterprise transformation projects. We are still a little siloed, and oftentimes the cyber industry is an afterthought. It's almost seen as a necessary evil. And to my mind, in an ideal world, a lot of what we do would just be built in, and it would be transparent and seamless into other large-scale enterprise initiatives. What do you think, Holly?
I think it's interesting, that point that you just said, and this is kind of what I see from an on-the-ground perspective, is that I see us right now is we're in this kind of step of everyone's trying to get up to date with security, right? Yep. So in my mind, it's funny, I just gave a presentation on this, right? Is that as a security practitioner, the logical approach is to always think about security first, right? So you start off with compliance, right? You ensure that your regulations and standards are up to date, because then that'll force your architectural changes. Whereas right now, I think what a really common problem that industries are seeing is that they're forcing these architectural changes and then thinking about compliance later, right? So it's more of that being reactive opposed to being proactive. So right now, what I see us as is we're kind of on this journey to help all these organizations accelerate to get to this level setting point where people can feel comfortable enough to say, yeah, security is embedded into my business processes. Like, I feel confident in that. My organization will never be 100% fully protected, but at least I have somewhat of the level of security and confidence that I know that security is being thought of when I think about my business as a whole. So that's kind of like my perspective on it. And I think just based off of what you were saying, what it sounds like to me is also just expect the unexpected with cyber. You never truly, like, we can forecast as much as we want, but I truly think, and I think that's the beauty of cyber, is that you don't really know. And that's why it is ever evolving. And that's why you will be constantly learning. It's because you just don't know. But just expect that there's always going to be worse or better things happening out of it. So yeah, it's a journey and it's a ride. So yeah.
I agree. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. And it kind of links back to what we were talking about before around, I think, communication and building consensus, and getting better engaged with business leaders. I've been pushing a concept for quite some time. Haven't had a lot of success, I'll be frank, around bring a buddy. And what I mean by that, I was at a session last week, a cybersecurity summit, and I was on stage and I actually said, why do we only have cyber professionals in the room? Where are the marketing, the communication experts? Where are the financial experts? Where are the compliance experts? Where are, the business leaders and the strategy leaders? And so I think that it's good for us as cyber professionals to identify a buddy in another part of the business or another part of the firm and bring him or her along with us to, cyber related discussions, to build bridges and get different perspectives. And I think that will help a lot to, get better consensus and make sure that we're seeing the bigger picture. And I think the other thing you touched on, which is really important, is, it's not about defense. It's not about locking things down. And I don't want to see padlocks on security documents. It's around resilience, right? It's around being able to respond quickly to a problem. It's about obviously having muscle memory. So your incident response capabilities are tested, they're up to date, they're relevant, but they're also flexible for on-prem and cloud-based systems. And if a problem does occur, you know what to do, and you know what to do very quickly. And I think that businesses and individuals that are thinking about cyber in that mindset will be able to flex for the future threats that we haven't yet got our heads around yet.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that was an awesome perspective to give. So I guess I'm just looking at the clock. I know we have a few minutes left, and I do just want to tie things up here a little bit. But I guess I just have a question, right? For people who are in the cyber field now, what would you recommend that they do from a skills and a qualifications perspective to kind of just tie this back to careers?
Great question. Well, I think a lot of what I would suggest is some of the things you've described, Holly. Getting plugged into organizations like CFF is a great start. Getting out into the community, making sure you're networking, you're using social media, and having the ability or the courage to challenge the status quo, I think will help the community a lot. And I know we're drawing on time, and I want to hand over to Val, but I have one final question for you, Holly, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
What's your cat's name?
Kiko.
Kiko.
Yeah.
It looks like
did you see her in the background? Yeah, she was running
gorgeous
around.
Cat.
So, yeah.
Well, Holly, thank you for joining today.
Course. No, thank you.
Val, I'll hand over to you for final words and observations.
Love that, and I'm glad the cat's name is cleared out as well. Along with all the technology problems. So, well, love the conversation, and I think thank you, Holly. And I'm envious William is able to work with you, and I'm sure it reflects upon the generations of young professionals and emerging leaders that we are working with. And thank you for sharing your thoughts. And William, as always, thank you for supporting us and making sure that this mission goes on. For CFF, especially the last point that you made about bring a buddy and expand the sphere of cyber thinking and the resilient thinking into the rest of the business. I think it's so important. And the last few months and years, we have learned that lesson in hard ways. I hope many don't have to go through that others have went through. And that's the lesson I think we need to kind of imbibe. But especially for this particular week, we are looking at kind of collectively reflecting on the lesson that we have learned in the last several years that we can pass on to the incoming talent pool and expand that talent pool. And Holly, your background is absolutely fascinating. I think that's what I want to bring in, and the breadth of creative thinking and problem solving that we can and should do needs kind of William's experience from years, knowing the nuts and bolts and the pipelines of how things work, but also I think English language problem. I think you probably heard him tell this many times that cybersecurity is still a very much an English language problem. It's not a technical problem. And that the sooner we can get to that language problem solved, we are able to communicate better. And it is definitely worth the other point that you mentioned, Holly, about communication, learning communication, and the true value of it during your school and academic curriculum. I think kind of emphasize on that whole reading and comprehension classes that we had from school onwards, right, was probably interesting. We're looking for that one chapter that's probably the funniest story. But how can we make this communication barriers go down? I will, self-reflect that this has been an issue that I've been struggling and as well as learning for my entire life, and that pushed us to where we are today in terms of making sure that we communicate well. Sometimes communication also needs to go with the timing of it, like what do you communicate when, especially in cyber, as you both can relate to it. What do you tell when there is a breach and you're notified, and when do you notify the authorities versus when do you notify your customers, consumers? So timing is another issue that comes with communication, and the different levels and perspectives that you have to keep to the same data that needs to be presented at different levels. So all that you said here is absolutely well received, and I think we'll continue to work on this, the inputs that you provided to us. So and of course, consulting is such a fruitful career, to be, and to see both ends of it. And as a budding and emerging leader, and William, pretty established in this field, I'm really thrilled that people have kind of role models to look for. So thank you again. We look forward to your continued collaboration, and William, your support, and Holly,